The next thing I want to take a look at are some lung volumes and capacities, and these are important for understanding what's going on in the respiratory function labs. And the lab has a pretty good description, but I thought it might help if I went over it again so you can hear it and see it as well as just reading it. So what you can see on the screen is a diagram that's been simplified a little bit from your lab guide that looks at some of the lung volumes that I want you to understand. So let's take a look at those together. What the drawing is showing you is sort of the movement of air in and out. So when we've got a diagram like this, we've got a line going up and a line going down and up and down. This is representing breathing in and breathing out. And this amount of air being breathed in and out normally is what's referred to as the tidal volume. So this amount of air that you breathe in, when you breathe in, which is the same as the amount of air you breathe out when you breathe out, this is the tidal volume, or the TV, the tidal volume. We know you can breathe in more air than you normally do. If you do a forced inspiration, you can get more air in. So if we breathe in the normal amount of air, that's the tidal volume from here to here, and then you breathe in more, as much as you can. So you breathe in as much air as you can. That line's going to go up quite a bit higher. That extra amount of air you can breathe in is called the inspiratory reserve volume. So from here, from the top of the tidal volume to as much as you can breathe in, that's your inspiratory reserve volume, the extra air you can breathe in after you've had a normal breath in. You also know that we can breathe out more than we would usually breathe out. So let's say we just do a normal breath, and then we breathe out normally. So there's our tidal volume, the normal amount we would breathe out. But then you breathe out more. You breathe out as much more as you possibly can. The extra air you can breathe out after you've breathed out your normal breath is called your expiratory reserve volume. The extra air you breathe out after you've already breathed out a normal breath. These are what we refer to as the lung volumes. We can start adding some of these numbers together to get what we call the lung capacities. The one I want you to know about is the vital capacity. The vital capacity refers to the whole amount of air that you have the ability to move. So if you breathe in as much as you can, so we're way up here at the top of the inspiratory reserve volume, and then you breathe out as much as you can, all the way down here to the expiratory reserve volume, that's what gives you your vital capacity. The maximum amount of air you can move from your highest breath in to as much as you can possibly breathe out. You can calculate this by adding together your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. One last volume I want you to know about is something that's called the residual volume. The residual volume refers to the amount of air that's left in the lungs after you've breathed out as much as you possibly can. Now remember, there's always going to be some air left in the lungs because we don't collapse our airways and all our alveoli when we breathe out. So even after you blow out as much as you possibly can, there's some air left in there. That's called the residual volume. If we add the residual volume to the vital capacity, we get what's called the total lung capacity. The total lung capacity represents the maximum amount of air you can get into your lungs. So that's your whole inspiratory reserve volume, your tidal volume, your expiratory reserve volume, and the residual volume all added together gives you the total lung capacity. These lung volumes and capacities are useful information, but they can be a little bit hard to determine without specialized equipment in a very controlled setting. Since we don't have a lot of complicated equipment in lab, we use some simple spirometers to get two important measures of lung function. Using this spirometer, we can determine the FVC, or the forced vital capacity, which is an estimate of the vital capacity, and we can also get an important measure of airflow called the FEV1, or the forced expiratory volume, in 1 second. So I'm going to demonstrate, just in case you didn't get to see this or use this in lab, so you can see how it works. If you're really interested, come find me someday before or after class and I'll let you try it. One thing about spirometry is that it requires effort. It requires a lot of effort. To do this well, I have to work really hard. what I'm going to do is take in a really deep breath, the biggest breath I can get in. So I'm going to try and get all my inspiratory reserve volume in there. And then I'm going to blow out as hard and as fast as I can through this mouthpiece, and then I'll measure the volume with the spirometer. You have to really squeeze your abdominal muscles and your pelvic muscles and try to get as much air out of your lungs as possible for this test to be valuable. When I look at the readout, I see that I have a forced vital capacity of about 3.08 liters, and I have a forced expiratory volume in 1 second of 2.76 liters. So let's take a closer look at what these numbers mean. The first number, the FVC, or forced vital capacity, refers to the amount of air you were able to move. So more is better. It means you have more lung capacity. And capacity can vary based on age, gender, height, level of activity, whether you have any underlying conditions or how well you feel. So there's a large variety there. There's a table of average values, and we can look up my average value on this table. I can push about 5'3" on a good day, and my age is between 35 and 40, so I land about here on the table. I should have a forced vital capacity around 3.3. My number that I showed you is a little bit lower than that, but not too far off. I usually run a little bit low for forced vital capacity. The second number, the FEV1, is a measure of airflow because it measures how much air was blown out in just 1 second. So the better airflow you have, the more you'll be able to blow out in that first second. On average, you should be able to blow out 75 to 85% of your forced vital capacity in the first second. So to evaluate the FEV1, we take the FEV1, the amount of air blown out in the first second, and divide that by the forced vital capacity. So when I divide my 2.76 by 3.01, I get about 89%. So I blow out 89% of my air in the first second. That's actually a little high and is an indicator that maybe I didn't have a really good effort on this test. Usually you should be between 75 and 85. Anything above that indicates maybe you didn't do a good job on the test. Anything below that indicates that you don't have good airflow. You may have plenty of volume in your lungs, but you can't get it in and out very quickly. If you have a problem with the volume of your lungs, so you don't have high enough volume, that's what's called a restrictive disorder. You could have a restrictive disorder where you have lower volume, but you can still blow out 75 to 85% of that low volume in 1 second, so airflow is considered fine. Or you could have a disorder where you have good volume in the lungs, but you have reduced airflow, in which case your forced vital capacity would be normal, but your FVC2 would be low, so you're blowing out a lower percentage of that air in the first 1 second. That's indicates an obstructive disorder. And some lung disorders are actually both. You can have some lung disorders that affect both volume and airflow, and those are called combined disorders. For more details, you should definitely check out your lab guide.